The period 1895 to 1918 was one of great political, social and economic change in Britain. When you examine the period, aim to consider what these changes were, what caused them, the extent of change and the response to it. In this section, we're going to look at three broad areas: political developments, foreign policy, and the impact of World War I. The election of 1906 saw a landslide victory for the Liberal Party. This section is going to focus on two changes instigated by the governments that followed: the welfare reform and the constitutional crisis in the House of Lords from 1909 to 1910. We're going to start with tackling the welfare reforms by looking at the following question. The social welfare reforms introduced by the Liberal governments of 1906 to 1914 were very successful at tackling poverty. Explain whether you agree or disagree with this statement. The first thing you should do after reading this question in the exam is take a pen and write all over your exam paper. Circle or underline the key words within the statement to make sure you know what you're supposed to be agreeing or disagreeing with. The question is about social welfare reforms, so you don't need to consider the success of, say, foreign policy. The question says liberal governments, so don't be tempted to write about conservative reforms. Finally, the date. This is important as it stops you going into considerations of policies made during wartime. The last part of the statement focuses your answer even further. Remember, you get marks for focusing on the success of liberal social welfare reform in dealing with poverty. Just writing a detailed account of the terms of each reform will not get you top marks. It's your ability to evaluate their success that will earn you points. One of the ways to avoid narrative is to plan. If you have a question asking whether you agree or disagree, try using a table like this one. If the question also asks you to use historical sources in your answer, it would also be helpful to clarify whether they agree or disagree with the statement in your table. Here's the introduction. Support for the poorest members of society was a key focus of the pre-war Liberal governments. They covered three main groups: children, the elderly, and workers. The extent to which these reforms dealt with poverty, however, is questionable. Whilst they clearly helped some, there were many who were still not included. Subsequently, some of the key causes of poverty weren't tackled. Okay, let's move on. Free school meals provided much needed nutrition for children from the poorest families. This would help to prevent diseases resulting from nutritional deficiencies, such as rickets. However, on the other hand, by 1914, only half the education authorities in England and Wales were implementing the policy. This is because until that year, it was voluntary. Free medical inspections and free medical treatment meant children's health could improve in families too poor to pay. However, many local authorities did not provide treatment until they were given funding in 1912. By 1914, 3/4 of local authorities were providing treatment. Free places at secondary schools for the poorest children meant that some were given the opportunity to gain a better education and increase their prospects of a better paid job. Only 1/4 of all places were free. Providing pensions at 70 meant that the elderly did not have to rely on charity from the poor law guardians or face the threat of the workhouse. It provided a regular income for those that had no other opportunity of receiving money. However, placing the age at 70 meant many who needed its support did not receive it, and in any case, life expectancy in 1900 was only 45. There was also criticism that the amount given was not enough. Exclusions meant some vulnerable elderly were not included, such as ex-convicts and those who had been on poor relief. Compensation paid to those injured or diseased through work meant that families whose main breadwinner was unable to work would not fall deeper into poverty. It did not provide, however, for those unable to return to work for the long term. Labour exchanges made it easier for the unemployed to seek jobs. By 1913, there were 430 exchanges. However, these were only voluntary. The National Insurance Scheme gave sick pay for 26 weeks to the worker, ensuring the family did not fall into poverty as a result of illness. Free medical attention helped the workers to return to work as quickly as possible. It did not, however, apply to the worker's family, with the exception of a maternity allowance, and did not cover the problems of long-term illness. The scheme also gave unemployment insurance, therefore supporting families when they had no income. It was, however, only for seasonal workers, and it was only for 15 weeks in a year, therefore not addressing the problem of long-term unemployment. Conditions of employment were also improved in shipping, mining, sweated trades, and shops and trade unions were also given greater powers to campaign for the rights of workers. However, these acts, and those we've already mentioned, did nothing for agricultural labourers, where some of the worst cases of poverty existed. An area not tackled at all was the provision of adequate housing, which would in turn improve the health of the poor. The Poor Law was still in place to pick up those to whom the new reforms did not apply. Right, over to you. What do you think? I've done the initial analysis for you. Look at the table. How successful do you think the Liberals were at dealing with poverty? Very successful, useless, or somewhere in the middle? Whichever view you take, try to support it with historical evidence. Another key feature of the pre-war Liberal governments was the dispute with the House of Lords in 1909 to 1910. Why did this happen? As a historian, it's your job to carry out investigations using evidence. However, you shouldn't just take it at face value. You need to evaluate it and ask yourself, how useful is this source for my investigation? Your examiner will want to find out how you use evidence, so you are quite likely to meet questions like this one. How useful is this source as evidence of the causes of the Liberals' clash with the House of Lords in 1909? Right, well, I would say this source is very useful because it tells me that the clash was about Lloyd George's budget, which the wealthy House of Lords did not like. That's an accurate answer, but it's not going to get me very many marks. So I think I'll use some evidence from the source to develop and support my statement. Here goes. This can be seen in the way Lloyd George is portrayed as a greedy and frightening giant. The use of the bludgeon with the word budget printed on the side indicates that Lloyd George is trying to force and bully the wealthy to pay. The small man underneath the table represents the frightened wealthier classes as he's trying to hide from the mighty Lloyd George. That's it, isn't it? Well, no. It would be if I'd been asked, what can I tell from the source about the causes of the clash? But I've also been asked to assess the usefulness of the source to an investigation. So how do I assess the source? By asking questions about it. I need to know more than the content. I need to be able to use my knowledge and place it in context. I also need to look at ways in which the source helps me to understand causes of the clash and the ways in which it doesn't. To help me to do that, I need to ask questions such as, what type of source is it? Who produced it? When was it produced? For what purpose was the source produced? Once I've asked these questions, I'll be placed in a much better position to fully answer the question. So let's finish off. The source is a cartoon from a magazine called Punch. Punch commented on the politics of the day in a satirical way. Moreover, the fact that the source is a cartoon and Lloyd George is shown in such an exaggerated way means that it's not intended to be an accurate account of events. It's more a reflection of one of the many views around at the time of the crisis. It's therefore helpful as it shows that some saw Lloyd George as a bully, trying to reduce the wealth and status of the rich. This may well have been the view of many of the lords at the time. However, the source is not an accurate reflection of the complex situation at the time and only examines an immediate cause of the crisis, and even that is shown from only one point of view. And as I'm sure you're well aware, things never happen because of one reason. Here's my mind map of the causes of constitutional crisis. It's a good idea when you're revising to aim to focus on key issues as well as the facts. Producing mind maps like this one will help you in the exam to focus on analysis and not fall into the trap of just writing everything you know about a topic. One of the key issues in studying foreign policy of this period is Britain's entry into World War I in August 1914. In the years leading up to this, Britain's relationship with Germany was strained, and this is the focus of our next question. Was tension between Britain and Germany in the years 1898 to 1914 a result of the creation of the Triple Entente? Often, questions will ask you to consider the causes of a decline in relations between Britain and Germany. As with other causation questions that are looking at your skills of evaluation, they're likely to require you to weigh up the significance of one cause against other factors. Okay? So let's answer that first question. The Triple Entente was an agreement of understanding between Britain and France in 1904 and Britain and Russia in 1907. Russia and France had already formalised relations in the Franco-Russian alliance of 1894. To Germany, this represented a breakdown of its policy to keep France diplomatically isolated to ensure German security. Germany now fell under threat of the possibility of facing a war on two fronts. The Schlieffen Plan, devised to combat this threat, relied on a swift victory over France. If the British supported France, this would be unlikely. Germany's reaction to this resulted in attempts to place the relationship Britain had with France under pressure. By provoking the Moroccan crises, Germany believed it would weaken British support for France. This, however, only served to strengthen ties between Britain and France, as demonstrated by the signing of the naval agreement in 1912. It deepened tension between Britain and Germany. Seen in the wider European context, there were now two alliance systems in operation in Europe. The British saw their involvement in the Triple Entente as essential to maintaining a balance of power within Europe and preventing German domination, which they saw as a threat to peace. The attitudes of the two countries were therefore unlikely to help their relationship. Is that enough to answer the question? Well, it certainly discusses the role of the Triple Entente in causing tension between Britain and Germany, but it hasn't recognised there are any other factors that may have caused tension. For a top-level answer, you would also need to consider the role of the Triple Entente in relation to the other factors you consider, such as protection of naval supremacy, protection of the empire, industrial and trade competition, attitudes of Kaiser Wilhelm, and the British press and public. The dates of the question are a clue to the need to consider wider factors. Dates are always given in a question to help you structure your answer and keep it focused, so always take note of them. The Entente Cordiale wasn't signed with France until 1904, so what was happening in 1898 that would lead to tension between Britain and Germany? Part of the German policy of Weltpolitik was a plan to develop the German Navy. In 1898 and 1900, Germany passed the Navy laws to begin the construction of a navy to rival that of Britain. This was to become an area of constant tension between the two countries. Britain had been the world's superior naval power throughout the 19th century. She saw it as an essential part of defending the empire and of national defence, as Britain was an island. Germany, on the other hand, was neither an island nor in possession of much of an empire. To the British, the only motive Germany could possibly have for developing such a large navy was as a direct threat to Britain. To the Germans, the navy was a way towards increasing prestige. Imitation is the greatest form of flattery, and perhaps at first, Germany saw Britain as the greatest power in the 19th century and wanted to simply emulate that power, not directly challenge it. What is key here is that neither side were willing to back down in what became a naval arms race. Britain responded to the navy laws by building 8 dreadnoughts by 1907. Germany's reply was to build her own. It was never open to negotiation that either side would consider reducing their own navy. Okay, I've demonstrated knowledge and I've discussed the reasons why Britain and Germany had strained relations over the navy. But what I do need to do is make a clear link back to the question. It's good practice in the exam to aim to do this at the end of each paragraph to keep your answer on track. The naval race was a key factor in creating tension between Britain and Germany in the years leading to the First World War. Neither side was willing to compromise. The direct challenge to Britain's domination of the seas was a major factor in encouraging Britain to take a more active role in seeking friendship with other countries such as France and Russia in the Entente. Whilst events such as the Moroccan crises may have caused a temporary rise in tension, the issue of the Navy was a constant barrier to a real understanding between the two countries. Germany's rising economic status could also be seen as a challenge to Britain's reputation as the workshop of the world. Whilst in Britain there was growing concern over its ability to compete in the new economic climate, Germany was becoming the leading industrial power in Europe. Tariffs were placed on British goods by Germany, which caused a certain amount of tension. However, on the whole, trade increased between the two countries during this period. Whilst Germany's status as an economic power may have added to British concerns over Germany, it certainly wasn't a major feature of tension. Britain's desire to protect her imperial interests was at odds with Germany's aim to increase prestige and trade opportunities through the acquisition of an empire. British actions, however, do not seem to indicate that this was a key factor. For example, in 1898, Germany and Britain made a joint loan to Portugal with secret clauses to divide any territories in Africa lost by Portugal equally. Germany had such a small empire it was unlikely to seriously challenge British dominance. Despite a press campaign against the Berlin to Baghdad railway, ultimately the British government removed its objections. On the other hand, there were areas of tension, such as the Moroccan crises and the German support for the Boers during the Boer War. When compared to the threat felt by Britain in relation to German naval strength and Germany's concerns over the Triple Entente, concerns over the empire seemed to be a lesser issue. Demonstrations of negative attitudes on both sides added to the tension that existed between Britain and Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm made several inflammatory statements which served to heighten tension. The Kruger telegram and the Daily Telegraph incident are two good examples of this. The attitude of the British press fueled the public's anti-German stance. For example, the press campaign against the Berlin to Baghdad railway. These incidents, however, were a reaction to tension that already existed from issues such as the alliance system and the naval race, so can be seen as a secondary factor in the existence of tension between Germany and Britain. In a longer answer like this one, always take the time to conclude. It's your last chance to show the examiner that you have really understood the demands of the question. Try to leave them in no doubt that you deserve a good mark for your answer. Make sure you state your argument and provide a brief summary as justification. Don't introduce anything new at this stage. In a question that relates to causes, aim to identify the key factor. If it's not the one in the question, explain why. If you're stuck for how to start off, try to use the wording of the question. It'll keep you focused. So here goes. Tension between Great Britain and Germany can be seen as a result of a combination of factors, of which the creation of the Triple Entente can be seen as a key factor. Germany's fear of encirclement meant that she was unlikely to accept the status quo of the Entente and work to undermine it. However, this was not solely a British issue in a way that the naval race was. The naval race created an intractable issue that, even if other problems such as the alliance systems had disappeared, would still have been an area of tension between Germany and Britain. Other factors such as imperial interest, economic competition, and attitudes fed into existing tensions rather than acted as a catalyst for tension. World War I was the first total war and saw many changes politically, economically, and socially. In this section, we're going to focus on the social impact. As for any change, try to assess how far things really changed. For example, it's useful to see whether change was just temporary during the war, or whether things returned to normal at the end, or whether there was a lasting impact. Explain briefly the meaning of dilution in the context of the war effort. This type of question usually appears at the beginning of the paper and is intended to test your understanding of key historical terms. These tend to be low-mark questions, so don't be tempted to write too much. You'll know not to because the questions will start with phrases like briefly explain or comment on. Dilution refers to the agreement made between the trade unions and the government at the end of 1915, whereby skilled positions would be taken by semi or unskilled workers, men and women, for the duration of the war. It was part of the terms of the Treasury Agreement. Finished? No. The question does need to be a bit further addressed if you're going to gain good marks. To reach the top levels, you need to look at the final part of the question and place dilution in the context of the war effort. This decision came at a time when the number of army recruits was falling and the government needed significantly more to continue the war effort on the Western Front. The Derby scheme had not worked, and it was only a month after dilution was agreed that conscription was introduced. Dilution assured the government that work essential to the war effort on the home front would continue. What was the contribution of women to the war effort? This is an example of a mid-range question. The number of marks allocated will be higher than the previous question. You will need to consider more than one factor and develop your statements with evidence. For a top-level answer, you would also need to show evidence of evaluation. For example, did their contribution change as the war progressed? What were the most important contributions? At the start of the war, women's direct contribution was very little. As everyone expected it to be a quick war, there seemed little need to change the status quo of women's role in the home and in low-paid, unskilled jobs such as domestic service. Their contribution was limited to encouraging men to join the war, as the army at first relied on volunteers. Gradually, as the war continued well into 1915, it became clear that women would need to take on a much greater role. One of the key contributions women made to the war effort was the dangerous work in the munitions factories. They were able to keep the front line supplied with ammunition. Their contribution was, however, in a wide range of roles, keeping the home front going whilst men were fighting on the Western Front. Women worked in the land army to ensure food was available to combat the German U-boat blockade. They also took on a range of occupations that had previously been the prerogative of men, such as bus conductors, miners, lorry drivers, police and administrators. The introduction of dilution further opened the door to skilled work. Women's contributions weren't just restricted to the lower classes. Women from middle and upper classes also worked mainly in white-collar occupations, nursing, or for the voluntary organisations such as the Voluntary Aid Detachment. The VAD gave valuable medical support on the Western Front. Conditions were tough, and the women were dealing with severe injuries in difficult circumstances. With men at war, many women also took on greater responsibilities for the household, taking the traditionally male roles in financial management, for example. Women's contribution to the war effort was therefore enormously important. Their work in the munitions factories kept the front line supplied with the ammunition it needed, and in the many other jobs they carried out, they were able to keep their home front functioning. Those that joined organisations such as the Voluntary Aid Detachment directly contributed to the work on the Western Front by tending to the sick and injured soldiers. To what extent were lives transformed by World War I? Whenever you see the words "to what extent," or "how far," or "do you agree that," you should instantly recognise that the question is going to require analysis and evaluation, and not simply description. As analysis questions often carry more marks, it's wise to plan them before you start. Okay, let's answer the question. In each section, I'm going to start with a statement, support it with evidence, and then relate back to the question. Using this strategy helps keep your answer linked to the question. In the course of the war, the level of government involvement in people's lives increased significantly. The Defence of the Realm Act gave the government powers over the economy and extended into areas such as censorship. It would be hard to argue against this. The only point you could make here is that perhaps this was a progression from the liberal reforms of the pre-war government, so not a complete change. But if that was the case, then the level of involvement after the war would have continued in the same way, and it didn't. However, people were more accepting of greater government interference after the war. Therefore, whilst a long-lasting transformation is a bit strong, there was certainly a permanent shift in attitude. The role of women changed as a result of the war. As we have just seen, the vacant jobs left by men fighting on the front line meant that women could move out of traditional forms of female employment, such as domestic services, towards better paid, more skilled jobs, working alongside men. Women worked in a variety of industries, such as munitions, mining, banking, and policing. Some women from higher classes experienced work for the first time. Women found greater independence and effectively became heads of households in the absence of their husbands. Not only were their lives transformed, but men too began to take women's roles more seriously. However, a long-lasting transformation was not so clear. Women were still not treated as equals to men. For example, in the Representation of the People Act, all men over 21 received the vote. In the workplace throughout the war, women encountered prejudice from their male co-workers and superiors. At the end of the war, many women were forced out of their wartime positions, though they were reluctant to return to domestic service. During the years following the war, there is evidence of greater independence for women, such as the increase in the number of female white-collar workers and the achievement of equal voting rights in 1928. The war, therefore, did not completely transform women's lives, but it certainly began to change attitudes towards women and began to open up greater opportunities. The war also began to change and break down the rigid class barriers that existed before World War I. On the Western Front, officers and soldiers shared the same dangers and faced hardships and problems together. The numerous mistakes made by the upper ranks of the army led to many of the lower classes no longer simply accepting the dominance of the upper classes. Back at home, everyone, no matter what their class, was supporting the same cause and were treated the same under the Defence of the Realm Act. The upper and middle classes also cut back on part of their privileged lifestyles, such as reducing the number of servants they had. However, on the other hand, class distinctions still existed and reasserted themselves at the end of the war. Education in particular is a good example where class barriers continued to exist throughout and after the war. The lives of the working classes were affected by the war in many ways. The food controller ensured there was a fair distribution of food to all on the home front. Food prices were fixed in July 1917, when quantities of meat, sugar and wheat began to reduce, making food accessible to more than just the rich. Rationing was introduced at the end of 1917. Those from the poorest backgrounds on the Western Front actually found their diets improving, despite the poor quality of food available. Part of the Treasury Agreement of 1915 ensured wage levels were kept in line with the cost of living. By the end of the war, millions had lost their lives, and many households across the country were without the traditional male head of the household. A generation of young men had been killed, injured, or traumatized by the horrors of the Western Front, and society in the post-war years had to deal with this impact. This was a major and lasting transformation. Things could not simply return to the way they were in the pre-war years. In previous sections, we've looked at what a good conclusion should do. Try here to write your own. Remember, refer to the question, state your argument and briefly summarise the key points of your answer.